The Atlantic slave trade and slavery had serious consequences for everyone involved, including Africa, the enslaved, the 13 colonies, and eventually the United States. The Atlantic slave trade affected the continent of Africa, especially West Africa. Africa experienced a large loss of population during the slave trade. This was especially true of males in West Africa. More males were captured and traded to be sold in the New World than females. The slave trade also led to an increase in conflict between groups in Africa. Many of the Africans that were sold into slavery were captured during battles. This led rival groups to go to war with each other. This way, groups could become wealthy and powerful by capturing prisoners and selling them into the slave trade. The slave trade also led to economic stagnation in Africa. During the period of the slave trade, people became Africa's largest export. The Atlantic slave trade affected African Americans. First, African Americans were forcibly removed from their homeland and were transported to the New World. Africans that were sold into slavery in the colonies lost their freedom. They became the property of their masters. The idea that slaves were property removed their ability to have rights and allowed their masters to treat them brutally. Slaves and free African Americans also faced limited education. It was illegal to educate slaves in most places because of the fear of slave uprisings. Slaves and free African Americans also faced less opportunity than their white counterparts. Great pressure was also put on the families of slaves. These families were often separated by selling family members to split them up. The Atlantic slave trade had cultural, economic, and political consequences on the United States. Slaves contributed to U.S. culture through their folklore, art, music, and cuisine. The U.S. economy in both the North and the South centered around slavery, the resources they produced, trade of these resources, and manufacturing finished goods from those resources. There were also political consequences of slavery. Laws and amendments were passed to both protect the rights of freed slaves, while at the same time, laws were passed to limit the freedom of African Americans.